You raised them with love. You gave them everything, your time, your strength, your patience, your sleepless nights. You showed up, even when no one saw it. You sacrificed in silence, poured yourself into their lives, and asked for nothing in return, only that they'd grow up happy, healthy, and whole. And they did. But now that they're grown, something feels different. Maybe they don't call as often. Maybe they interrupt you mid-sentence. Or they roll their eyes when you offer advice. Maybe they make you feel like a burden, like your thoughts don't matter. Your time isn't valuable, or your presence is just optional. And you wonder, when did I become invisible? It's a pain that's hard to put into words. Not because you expect to be worshipped. Not because you want to control their lives. But because deep down, all you ever wanted was to be respected. To be seen. To be treated like your voice still matters. And when the very people you sacrificed the most for begin to dismiss you, it doesn't just sting, it breaks something inside. But here's the truth. You're not alone. So many parents, especially those over 65, find themselves in this quiet ache. They love their children deeply, but they feel pushed aside, talked over, and forgotten. And the instinct is often to give more, to try harder, to stay useful, hoping that if they just keep showing up, their children will start appreciating them again. But the key to changing this dynamic isn't about doing more or proving yourself. It's about returning to something deeper, something quieter, something powerful. It's about remembering your worth. In this video, we're going to walk through 6 powerful things you can do, not to demand respect, but to inspire it. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to argue. And you certainly don't need to beg for their attention. What you need is to reconnect with the strength that's always been inside you. Because when you start treating yourself with quiet dignity, when you begin to live not for their approval, but from your own truth, something begins to shift. They may not notice it right away, but they will feel it. And in time, they'll begin to see you differently, not as someone who's waiting for their love, but as someone who commands respect simply by being who they are. You raised them with love. Now it's time to raise yourself with love, too. When your children start treating you with less respect, cutting you off mid-sentence, rolling their eyes when you speak, brushing off your advice, it's natural to feel hurt, even angry. You may find yourself wanting to remind them of everything you've done, the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the love you gave without limits. You want them to see that you still matter. And often, the instinct is to push back, to argue, to defend yourself, to make them listen. But here's something hard and true. Arguing rarely leads to respect, it usually deepens the divide. You can't force someone to see your worth by raising your voice. You can't demand to be heard by repeating your value louder. In fact, the more you try to prove yourself, the more it may seem like you're trying to win something, when all you really want is to be seen and valued. And that's exactly why leading by example is far more powerful than any argument. Respect isn't earned through shouting. It's earned through presence, through quiet strength, through how you carry yourself in the face of disappointment. I once knew a man named Frank, a retired teacher who had once led a classroom with grace and confidence. But at home, his grown children treated him like he was irrelevant. They laughed off his concerns, ignored his advice, and spoke to him with condescension. At first, Frank fought back, raising his voice, listing off all he'd done for them. But the more he argued, the less they listened, the more emotional he became, the more they dismissed him. Then one day, Frank stopped trying to win. He stopped debating. He stopped pleading. Instead, he started listening, not out of weakness, but out of strength. He spoke with calm. He carried himself like someone who didn't need their approval to know his own worth. He still shared his thoughts, but without the need to be right. And slowly, his children noticed. They began listening more, interrupting less, not because he forced them to, but because they began to sense his inner dignity. They couldn't ignore it. That's the power of restraint, of composure, of being the example, not the argument. If your children are treating you with less care, don't lower yourself to their level. Don't let their tone pull you into a shouting match or emotional spiral. Instead, speak less but with more intention. Stand tall in who you are. Let your actions reflect your wisdom and your calm confidence. Over time, that quiet strength sends a message louder than words ever could. I know who I am. I don't need to fight for respect. I live in a way that earns it. And slowly, without confrontation or conflict, the way they see you begins to shift. Not because you demanded their respect, but because you modeled what true respect looks like. One of the hardest lessons we face as we grow older is realizing that we can't depend on our children for emotional fulfillment. We love them deeply. We've poured our lives into raising them, supporting them, cheering them on, so it's only natural to want that connection to stay strong as the years go on. But when that connection starts to fade, when they don't call as often, when visits grow shorter, when affection feels forced or distant, it can leave a quiet ache in your heart. And your instinct may be to hold on tighter, to call more, to remind them how much you miss them, to keep giving in hopes that they'll start showing the love you crave. But the truth is, the more emotionally dependent you become, the more they may start to pull away, not because they don't love you, but because dependence creates pressure. And pressure often leads to distance. I once knew a woman named Helen. She had raised her children with warmth and care. But as they grew into adults, got married, had children of their own, Helen found herself waiting by the phone. Every ring lifted her spirits. Every silence broke her heart. And when they didn't call, she called them, again and again. She reminded them how much she missed them, how empty the house felt, how she wished they'd visit more often. But instead of bringing them closer, it pushed them further away. Her calls became something they had to return, not something they wanted to. Her love became a responsibility instead of a joy. Then one day, something changed. Helen stopped waiting. She stopped calling first. She started investing in her own happiness, joining a community group, walking with neighbors, rediscovering things she once enjoyed. And something surprising happened. Her children started reaching out more. Not out of guilt, but out of genuine interest. They saw her not as someone lonely and waiting, but as someone who still had a life of her own. And with that shift came a new kind of respect. You see, people, yes, even your own children, respect those who are emotionally independent. When you stand on your own 2 feet, when your happiness doesn't hinge on their attention, they begin to see you differently. Not as a burden, but as a person of value. So ask yourself, are you leaning too much on your children for emotional reassurance? Are you waiting on them to make you feel whole? If so, it might be time to shift the energy inward. Focus on the things that bring you peace, joy, purpose. Reclaim the parts of yourself that existed before your identity was wrapped around being a parent. Because when you stop needing their love to feel complete, they'll start giving it more freely. And not because you asked for it, but because they genuinely want to be close to you again. One of the biggest reasons adult children stop showing respect is because their parents stop requiring it. And most of the time, it doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, over years of staying silent, letting things slide, and telling yourself, it's not worth the fight. You excuse their tone, you let them interrupt, you tolerate eye rolls, sarcasm, and being talked over. Why? Because you want to keep the peace. Because you love them. Because you hope they'll grow out of it. But here's the truth. People will treat you the way you allow them to. Setting boundaries isn't about conflict. It's not about yelling or cutting people off. It's about calmly deciding what kind of treatment you will and won't accept, and following through when that line is crossed. It's about protecting your dignity without threatening theirs. Because if you don't define the line, they won't see one, and over time, the lack of boundaries turns into a lack of respect. I once knew a man named Robert. He had been a confident businessman, respected by colleagues and employees alike. But at home, his adult children interrupted him constantly. They dismissed his opinions and often criticized his choices, from how he dressed to how he spent his time. At first, Robert brushed it off. He thought, they're busy. They don't mean it. I don't want to stir up trouble. But the more he stayed quiet, the worse it got. Eventually, he realized something painful. His silence was teaching them how to treat him. So Robert decided to make a change, not with anger, but with clarity. One evening, when his son cut him off in mid-sentence, he calmly said, "I'll finish my thought when you're ready to listen." When his daughter dismissed his suggestion with a laugh, he replied, "You don't have to agree with me, but I expect you to respect me." And when they crossed the line again and again, he followed through, stepping back from visits, limiting phone calls, and making it clear. Respect is the price of connection. At first, his children pushed back. They were uncomfortable. They didn't understand why the man who used to tolerate so much was suddenly different. But over time, they adjusted. They listened more. They spoke more thoughtfully, not because he forced them to, but because they began to see his value again. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks. They don't shut people out. They teach people how to come in. So ask yourself, where in your relationship have you let too much slide? What behavior have you silently accepted that you wouldn't tolerate from a stranger? It's not too late to speak up, not with anger, but with strength, because when you show your children how to treat you, eventually, they will as parents. Giving comes naturally. We give time, energy, advice, money, care. We give out of love, habit, and instinct. And for years, that giving helped our children grow, succeed, and find their way. But at some point, many parents realize something has changed. The giving doesn't seem to mean as much anymore. The thank yous become fewer. The expectations grow stronger. And instead of appreciation, we're met with entitlement, or worse, indifference. Here's the hard truth. When you give to people who no longer appreciate it, you don't deepen love, you build expectation. And over time, what used to be kindness becomes invisible. Your generosity, instead of being a gift, becomes something they expect. And when it's not there, they get frustrated, not because they're hurt, but because they've come to take it for granted. I once knew a man named George. A loving father. Generous to a fault. Anytime his adult children needed help, financial support, a ride to the airport, babysitting the grandkids, he said yes. Even when it was inconvenient. Even when it disrupted his own plans. He told himself, that's what good parents do. But the more he gave, the more they demanded. They stopped saying thank you. They started assuming he'd always be there. Always say yes. And when he finally needed help, when he was recovering from surgery, they were too busy. That's when something inside him shifted. George realized that his constant giving hadn't built closeness, it had built dependency. And so, he made a change. He didn't cut them off. He didn't lash out. He simply stopped offering help before it was asked. He started saying no when it didn't feel right. He began valuing his own time the way he had always valued theirs. At first, his children were surprised, even annoyed. But over time, something changed. They started thanking him again. They began asking, not assuming. They realized that his generosity wasn't infinite. It was a choice, not a duty. And because of that, they began to treat it, and him, with more respect. The lesson is simple but powerful. When you give without appreciation, you teach people that they don't have to value you. But when you give with intention, when you give with boundaries, you remind them that your time, your love, and your energy are precious. So ask yourself, are you giving because it brings you joy? Or because you feel like you have to? Are you being met with gratitude, or with expectations? You deserve to be appreciated, not just for what you give, but for who you are. And when you start giving from a place of self-respect, not obligation, your children will notice, not right away, but eventually. They'll see the value in what you offer, because it's no longer something they assume, it's something they're grateful to receive. For so many parents, raising children becomes the center of life. Every decision, every sacrifice, every ounce of love is poured into helping them grow. And when they're small, that devotion makes perfect sense. They need you, they depend on you, and you gladly build your life around their needs. But as they grow up and move on, something strange and painful can happen. You realize your whole world still revolves around them, even though theirs no longer revolves around you. That realization can be lonely. You might find yourself waiting for their calls, rearranging your days to accommodate their visits, or holding back from building a life of your own, because a part of you still believes that being a good parent means being constantly available. But here's what many don't realize. When your happiness depends entirely on your children, they can start to feel suffocated, or worse, disconnected. I once knew a woman named Eleanor. She was a devoted mother and a loving wife. After her husband passed, she poured all her time and energy into her adult children. She called them daily, offered advice they didn't ask for, and quietly hoped they'd fill the emotional space her husband once held. But instead of drawing them closer, her constant presence pushed them away. The calls got shorter, the visits less frequent. She was heartbroken and confused. She gave them everything. Why were they pulling away? Eventually, Eleanor realized something profound. Her children didn't need her to stop loving them, but they did need her to start loving herself again. So she made a change. She joined a book club, started volunteering at a local food pantry, took a weekend trip with friends. She began doing things not as someone's mother or widow, but simply as Eleanor. And something incredible happened. Her children started calling more. They wanted to know about her day, her activities, her thoughts. They admired her independence. They respected her again, not just as their mom, but as a person with a full and meaningful life of her own. You see, people, your children included, are drawn to those who have purpose. When they see you enjoying life, growing, laughing, contributing, they begin to see you not as someone clinging to their attention, but as someone worthy of admiration. And that quiet shift changes everything. So if you've been waiting for the calls, the visits, the invitations, maybe it's time to stop waiting. Start living. Start finding joy in the things that once lit you up. Reconnect with old hobbies. Say yes to new friendships. Give yourself permission to matter outside the title of mom or dad. Because when you build a life that's rich, fulfilling, and yours, your children will notice, not because you begged for their time, but because you inspired their respect, simply by living fully again in the end. Respect isn't something we can demand. It's something we live into, quietly, firmly, and with grace. If your children have stopped treating you with the dignity and care you deserve, don't waste your precious energy begging for what should be freely given. Instead, take a different path, one of quiet strength, one of deep self-respect. Stop chasing their approval, led by the calm example of someone who knows their worth. Let go of emotional dependence. Because your joy is not theirs to manage, it's yours to create. Set boundaries with love, not anger. Give, but only when your giving is valued. And most importantly, remember that your life doesn't end at parenthood. You still have dreams, wisdom, purpose, and it's never too late to rediscover them. Because when you stand tall in your truth, when you live not to be needed, but to be whole, you shift the dynamic. They begin to see you not as someone waiting for love, but as someone who inspires it. Not as a parent clinging to the past, but as a person still becoming. And in time, that quiet, dignified presence speaks louder than any words. It says, I raised you with love, and now, I continue to live, with love for myself.